All right. Okay, great. So let's get started. What we are going to be going over today is the new results from our State of Software Distribution 2022 survey. So as a heads up, like I said, we'll have a short Q&A at the end of this session. And if you have any questions while we go, feel free to enter them into the chat. If I don't have a chance to get to them while we're going over the data, I will get back to them at the end of the presentation. Cool. So a little bit of background for those who may not have seen our report last year. This is our second annual software distribution survey. And you know what they say, 3 years means a trend. So we are only 1 year away from trending. So watch out, Twitter. But this report in particular surveyed 584 qualified participants from commercial software companies across 5 continents. I know that Antarctica was not included there. I'm not sure what other continent was left out, but a very large sample size. The primary research goal of this was to understand and quantify the current use, need, and challenges of on-premises software and its deployments, as well as investigate the adoption of container-based applications and the use of Kubernetes throughout the industry. So business and technology professionals at executive, manager, and frontline professional seniority levels, representing software companies of all sizes, were invited to participate in this survey on their company's behalf to talk about software delivery options and their use of containers. So this data is very new. In fact, we got this data about a week ago, and we're in the process of building our current content campaigns based on the results of it. But the entirety of the report produced some pretty fascinating data. So we also run this survey for replicated customers so we can contrast the results between them and the general industry. And that replicated customer survey is still currently live, so we don't have the results yet. We do, however, have the results from last year's replicated customer survey, so we can use that as a general barometer for some of the slides we'll see today. So let's take a quick look at the companies and participants that are reflected in this year's survey, and then we'll jump into some data. So for companies represented, we wanted to ensure a wide range of companies. So about 20% fell in that 20 to 200 employee range. The largest demographic we had was in the 200 to 1,000 employee range. A quarter of the respondents were 1,000 to 5,000, and the rest were made up of companies larger than 5,000. As far as individuals that participated, they really varied in seniority. A little over half fell under a managerial title. Exactly a third of the participants were executives. And like I said, we had a departure from last year. So we invited frontline professionals to take part in this year's survey so we could get a closer look at some of the technical demands of these delivery teams. We wanted to learn a bit more about support escalations and mean time to resolution and things like that. So their participation was a very nice addition to this year's results. Finally, on the left, you can see responsibility-wise how the demographics fell. People all over software development and architecture, product management, customer support and success, as well as executive team members. So let's dive into some of the more interesting results from the survey. So as far as high-level takeaways, these were a lot of the big things that popped out. 75% of companies indicated that their on-premise software sales have grown in the last 5 years. Companies this year said that they are offering on-prem at a higher rate than SaaS, although this should be clarified a little bit right now. The word on-prem conjures different things for different people, and for the sake of Replicated's case, we outlined our definition of on-prem at the beginning of this survey for participants. For this survey, on-prem literally means customers install on their infrastructure, no matter where it is. So that might be a data center, it might be a private cloud, it might be on a public cloud platform or hybrid cloud. So for instance, a single tenant customer managed instance on a public cloud is still something we consider on-prem. SaaS in this case would mean a multi-tenant public cloud offering, and that's it. Cool. So moving on, we've seen on-prem customer satisfaction go up from last year. This year, 93% of customers reported favorable NPS ratings from their customers on their on-prem software. We've also seen the proliferation of container-based deployments continue to grow. So 90% of companies have said that they use containerized applications in their production environments. An additional 5% plan to offer their software in containers over the next 24 months, and 81% are using Kubernetes for on-prem software. So finally, a lot of what we try to take away from this survey is not just the sunshine and roses of on-prem is growing and everybody loves containers, but those struggles that independent software vendors face with their on-prem software. So we've seen the proliferation of containerization in Kubernetes and software. We also want to see the pain that goes along with this sometimes. So 96% of companies reported that they're using teams of over 5 full-time employees on their product and delivery teams to ship on-premises versions of their software. Lastly, and one of the biggest takeaways is that only 16% of companies reported being able to configure and deploy their on-prem software for their customers in under 7 days. So those are a couple big takeaways. We'll dive into this data. We can take a closer look at these as well as some other things. So let's take a look in closer detail. So our first section, on-premises software continues to grow to meet customer needs. So like I said, a whopping 75% of companies indicated that their on-premises software sales are growing, while an additional 21% said their on-prem business stayed about the same. That left only 4% of the general industry saying their on-prem sales have shrunk in the last 5 years. So this really illustrates what we wanted to get into with this section, is that not only are on-premises solutions still in demand, but they've prominently grown as more options for these delivery options become available. So adding to that, we can see that companies are offering on-premises software at a higher rate than SaaS. So again, to clarify, our definition of on-prem for the sake of this survey means customers installing their own infrastructure, no matter where that is, data center, private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, et cetera. So while not a huge discrepancy from last year, this was pretty surprising in the face of the last decade of SaaS dominance. Last year, we saw SaaS being offered at an equal tick to on-prem. This year, we were slightly shocked to see that independent software vendors are offering on-prem at an increased rate. This is probably due to the fact that more enterprise-sized companies participated in this year's survey. And a lot of times these companies have had on-prem solutions in place for as long as decades, but still a very, very interesting takeaway. This is a select all that applies. So we saw that about 55% of participants responded that their company is offering both an on-prem and a SaaS version of their software. But to see over 80% of respondents saying that they offered some form of a customer managed install was really interesting. Expanding on that, we use conditional logic in these surveys to take participants through different questions based on their answers. And this was presented to all participants that answered that they offer an on-prem version in that last question. So this represents about 480 of the total respondents out of a pool that was 584. So this question was, where do your customers want to install your company's software? After that, they'd responded that they do in fact sell an on-prem version. So we can see about 40% of these companies have customers looking for air-gap on-premises deployments, so isolated from the internet. This was a slight rise above last year, where we saw only about 30% of the general industry reporting their customers wanted air-gap installs. Next, we saw about 64% of customers looking for public cloud on-prem installs, meaning that the application's resources are controlled by the customer despite the deployment being on any major public cloud platform like AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle, and so on. As a slight side note here, we did see an increase of Alibaba Cloud among options being offered to customers. Last year, we had it pretty low at about 5%, and it jumped to about 12% this year. So not anything to really build a slide around, but very interesting to see Alibaba Cloud being offered so much more. So customer data center came in slightly higher at the same tick we saw last year. But interestingly enough, we saw private cloud edging out all the other responses as the top choice for on-prem deployment options. So while still a relatively minimal difference between the top 3 choices, air-gap, customer data center, and private cloud all saw a slight rise from our results last year, indicating that customer managed on-prem installs outside of the public cloud are showing signs of increased usage in a world that we've seen distributed teams become the norm in the face of a global pandemic. And so I know what you're all thinking at this point. Did COVID save on-prem? And I don't think that we can conclusively say yes or no, but yes, no, it absolutely did, 100%. Keep in mind that that is a personal opinion and in no way reflects the feelings of replicated or dimensional research at all. And I need to make sure that you understand that. But moving on, not only do I think that COVID saved on-prem, but companies are seeing more than half of their annual revenue come from on-prem installs as well. So this question asked, what percentage of your customers deploy your software on-premise? We can see that 54% of total respondents answered that half or more of all their software sales are going to on-prem customers. It's easy to see with these customers representing those larger revenue deals than, say, a SaaS deal, that on-premises versions of your app are no longer a nice to have. And while they're both relatively small numbers, It's interesting to see that survey participants relayed that over 90% of their customers are using on-prem versions at a higher rate than participants who answered less than 10%. So pretty telling to that overall narrative of on-premises software growth. So moving on, container-based deployments are the norm. I apologize, Google Slides never likes to play well with me. Container-based deployments are the norm. So this question was, one of the primary challenges of on-premises software is managing the deployment. And so conventional on-prem deployments take months of engineering time and require significant amounts of work. The rise of containerization in Kubernetes has really helped shorten those deployments to days, even hours, and they've helped span that gap. And this survey's results really hammered that home. At almost the same numbers as last year, 90% of respondents said that their customers are using containerized applications in their production environments. Further showing that the embrace of containerization across independent software vendors in no way narrows the markets that they can target. So sticking with that trend, 95% of companies reported that they are currently or planning to offer containerized versions of software to customers within the next 24 months. So 90% are offering it now, and half of the ones that are not are planning to within the next 2 years. So again, as a surprise to nobody, the de facto leader of container orchestration systems is, unsurprisingly, Kubernetes. We had 81% of survey participants report that their companies are utilizing Kubernetes for their on-prem software. Interestingly enough, this was a slight decrease from last year, where we saw 86% of respondents declaring their company used Kubernetes for on-prem. But between the increase in respondents in this year's survey, there's about 180 more people who took part in the survey, as well as the inclusion of more enterprise-sized companies. This could probably be chalked up to a discrepancy in that respondent pool. Either way, we can see that proliferation of Kubernetes for on-prem software. For a little bit of context on that, Kubernetes has really experienced this increased popularity among the developer community over the past few years, and it's been widely embraced as that evolutionary next step in application architecture. Reasons for that are the move from infrastructure as code, using Ruby, JavaScript, Python, to infrastructure as data, specifically YAML, and ensuring every resource in Kubernetes, from pods to configs to deployment, is all expressed through a YAML file. Changes like these vastly reduce the time and resources necessary to build and deploy maintainable software, and they promote those best practices for inter-organizational collaboration through things like GitOps. Adding to that, Kubernetes open source nature, the fact that it's updated 3 to 4 times a year and managed by the CNCF really do ensure that sustainable long-term ecosystem. So all these things really led to its embrace, and we've seen that reflected in these results from this year as well as last year. I expect we'll see it again next year. And finally, to the most important part that I really feel like is talking about that pain that comes along with on-prem. So on-premises software deployments are challenging and slow. While on-premises software delivery via Kubernetes is the clear answer, as we've seen from the last few slides, the data also highlights another challenge. Many of the companies we surveyed still struggle with the tedious and time-consuming complexities that accompany building modern on-premises software. So 96% of respondents answered that their on-prem software required a team of 6 or more full-time employees on the product and delivery team necessary to ship the on-prem version of their software. This can be read as slightly misleading, I suppose, as the range of the size of companies in this is pretty massive. We can't expect a company of 10,000 plus to have the same size teams as a company of 50, but keep in mind that companies of 20 to 200 in this survey made up 20% of the total respondents, and companies under 1,000 made up over half. So there was a lot of smaller companies reflected here. Even if we account for the 19% of companies surveyed that had employee counts over 5,000, this is pretty telling. We're going to get a lot more granular with this data when we release our full report and white paper on this soon. But as it stands, even the smaller companies surveyed are still struggling to ship their on-prem software with small agile teams. Almost more telling than that is the data on time to live. So essentially the time it takes to install and configure an application for your customers before they're in production and they actually realize that business value. So only 16% of the general industry reported being able to install and configure their on-premises software in customer environments in under a week. Even more telling, over 50% of the industry takes at least 15 days or more, with almost 30% reporting that they can't install and configure on-prem installs in under 2 months. So this is especially interesting when compared with the previous slide. 33% of companies that took this survey have dedicated teams of over 50 full-time employees working on nothing but installing and configuring on-prem installs of their software, yet only 16% can configure in less than a week. This really highlights that those teams with massive amounts of employee resources and talent being put behind on-prem, it's still very hard to deliver these on-premises installations quickly. So in stark contrast to that, we compared that with our customer results from last year's survey. So on the left, you can see the industry data from this year. On the right, you can see our replicated customer survey data from last year. And like I said, our customer survey is still live. We'll have the new data soon, but it's still telling. While the broader industry takes weeks or months to get up and running, replicated customers, over 65%, are live within the first week. So for subscription-based software companies, where only 10% of the total lifetime of a customer is secured in that initial purchase, and the other 90% comes with growth, delivering these business outcomes quickly has a significant impact on direct revenue. So this year's replicated customer survey drilled down on this question more. Like I said, we don't have that yet. We will soon, since we don't want to just know if it takes 7 days or less to install and configure your on-prem. I want to know if it takes 2 to 3 days. I want to know if it takes 24 hours. I want to know if it takes less than 2 hours. At least anecdotally, we know of handfuls of customers that are shipping that quickly, and it'll be really interesting to get those results this year. So like I said, while we don't have those results yet, we look forward to publishing those results alongside the general industry to drill down even further on how quickly replicated customers are delivering value, since clearly we can see the general industry still struggles with this. As another contrast, this is an interesting one between last year's customer survey and this year's data. So this question asks whether an organization was selling software currently to any of these verticals. Respondents who answered yes are reflected here. So for more context, this question asks whether they're selling to about 15 different verticals, from technology to fintech to telecommunications to media and advertising, and a whole lot more. We highlighted these 4 specific verticals for a reason, though. What we found were replicated customers are delivering their products to not only a broader set of customers than the general industry period, but they're selling to customers in the most secure industries like government, finance, healthcare, and manufacturing. So what it really means is that replicated customers can take on these high-value contracts. They can more easily sell internationally, where data locality laws force applications to be on-prem. And at the end of the day, if you can ship to any of these 4 verticals, you can ship to anywhere. The result is clearly a larger total addressable market and the ability to deliver to customers that represent your largest deals. Government, finance, healthcare, and manufacturing contracts are absolutely going to be your largest ARR deals. And in this case, we can see replicated customers can take on those contracts easier. So that is it for a very quick bird's eye view into some of the results from this year's survey. We'll be releasing the entire report within the next month, featuring much more information, including data on support escalations, mean time to resolution, on-premises customer security needs, and a whole lot more. So we'll be releasing alongside that a lot of content, from white paper analyses to webinars with our analysts that conducted these surveys, as well as comparative data between the general industry and replicated customers. So please be on the lookout for all of that, which you can get dates on by following our social media accounts, signing up for our newsletter, or you can just navigate over to replicated.com in the near future, and we'll get a nice big floating button for you to click and download everything you need. So thank you so much for your time. How much time?